everybody, DSP here, and today I'm going to be talking about something that is kind of unique, a situation that I've never really been in as of yet in all the years that I've been doing gameplay coverage and reviews and everything for YouTube and the internet. Telltale Games, who is a company that is at this point very well renowned for making episodic narrative games over the past several years, including The Walking Dead Seasons 1 and 2, as well as A Wolf Among Us, has released two new games in the past week. That's right, within 1 week's time, they released two completely different games for two completely different series of existing content. What I'm talking about is the last week's release of Tales from the Borderlands and this week's new release of Game of Thrones. And you may be saying to yourself, gee, I love Telltale Games episodic games. You know, I really enjoyed The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us was pretty good. But should I try out either of these games? And or if I only have a choice between one, which one is it that I should choose? And the purpose of this video is for me to give you a little bit of background on each game, explain to you exactly how they work, and then let you know what I honestly think as an answer to that question that I just proposed. So really, at the core here, what we need to talk about is the fact that these games take existing lore from different existing franchises and universes and puts it into this narrative-style dialogue choices that affect the course of the game style of game. If you remember in The Walking Dead, you had dialogue choices and different attitudes you could take with different people, and if people remembered that you said one thing instead of another, maybe they'd side with you, maybe they wouldn't. You had a choice to either protect someone or defend or attack them or let them go, maybe help someone. And a lot of the times in The Walking Dead, it ended up with one person dying or another one surviving because of the choices that you made over the course of the game. So what Telltale Games decided to do was broaden their horizons and try to do some other existing pop culture / video gaming franchises. And of course right now, Borderlands is a very well-known, highly regarded video game series that now has 3 official iterations. You had Borderlands 1 and 2 as well as the recent pre-sequel. And Game of Thrones is currently one of the hottest television shows ever, currently one of the highest rated shows that is going on right now in current production, as well as one of the most famous and popular fantasy book series in some recent memory. And so for Telltale to take up the reins of these two interesting and very popular franchises is cool, and at the same time it's like, wow, this is neat that you're going to get to see a different style when it comes to these things. You've never had an interactive kind of Game of Thrones thing before, and Borderlands has always been a first-person looter shooter. How is that going to translate into the narrative dialogue choice style of game that Telltale makes? So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's start with Tales from the Borderlands, which is really neat because unlike a lot of the other Telltale games that kind of either take direct characters or stuff out of the universes of what they're from, this game really introduces almost a completely new cast of characters that you've never met before, including Reese and Vaughn, who are 2 employees of Hyperion Corporation, one of the popular corporations from Borderlands story and lore. They're double-crossed by a new person who becomes basically their manager and demotes Reese down to janitor level. Reese now has to find a way to kind of double-cross this guy in the corporate world and jump ahead. And so he sets up this really important swap between money for what seems to be a vault key. And that's right, as you know, if you followed along Borderlands lore, vaults are these incredibly valuable areas hidden throughout the planet of Pandora where Borderlands takes place, where supposedly there's untold riches, power, wealth beyond your wildest imagination. And so the story starts out with Reese and Vaughn, these 2 corporate lackeys, going down to the very visceral, almost outlandish kind of planet of Pandora where martial law rules. All these raiders and everything are kind of going on, almost a Mad Max-like atmosphere, and they're struggling to survive, trying to even get to this meat, trying to get this key traded off. On the flip side, there's actually a whole group of people involved on the other side of the equation who are setting up the meat with the vault key. And these are basically a bunch of either, you know, scam artists, double-crossers, swindlers. They're from Pandora. This is exactly what they do. And they are trying to set up this meat to try to get the money for this vault key. And it's cool because you get 2 completely different sides of the story. The guys on one side of the deal, the people on the other side of the deal. Right at about the 1 hour mark, the whole first episode of this game flips on its head as it continues on, and now both of the groups are kind of mixed and matched and interacted, and they get thrown into this wild journey where they're on a wild goose chase after the money and the vault key, and then they end up getting caught up with the psycho raiders from Borderlands, and there's a big crazy Mad Max-like arena race. It's really neat, it's fun, it takes elements from the lore and the game design of Borderlands and combines it with, again, that narrative kind of dialogue structure of Telltale Games and combines it into one. Does it work? And the answer is absolutely it works. What you get here is a game that's fast-paced, interesting, some of the best or well-written dialogue choices that I've seen in a while, meaning you can choose to have a character, for example, one of the main protagonists can either be like a snarky, cynical kind of guy, a cocky guy who's very confident, or a wimpy corporate guy who really is not very strong and isn't good at what he's doing down on Pandora. So really, depending on your choices, you can actually make the character seem like a different person per your choosing on the fly, okay, which I like. And I like the fact that there were so many characters. It was a wide cast of characters that are all different, different backstory. I'm trying not to spoil too much, even though there are story spoilers, obviously, in this video. And it's really good. It's about over 2.5, I'm sorry, excuse me, it's just under 2.5 hours worth of content. That's right, I know usually these Telltale games, for their episodic games, end up lasting maybe 90 minutes long tops. This one actually lasts more than 2 hours long, and actually feels like you're taking part of this really well-written, funny, kind of action, comedy style movie. It's fast-paced, it's interesting, it's fun for the most part. There is optional stuff that you can find while you're playing it, and I really enjoyed it. It is in the typical cel-shaded kind of graphics that Telltale Games usually do, and I think it was a really good outing. Now, if you're a fan of Borderlands, for its lore, for the game design and all that, you're probably going to love Tales from the Borderlands. But if you're a hardcore Borderlands fan who's a looter shooter, I don't know if this game honestly is going to appeal to you because there's no first-person shooting at all, there's no looting, none of that exists in this game. It's a completely different style of game. Just because it's set in the universe that you like doesn't mean you're going to like it. Imagine if there was a checkers game set in the Street Fighter universe. Just because Ryu and Blanca are moving checkers around the board doesn't mean that you're going to like that game. You know what I mean? And so, I'm wondering if you are a fan of Borderlands but only for the gameplay, which quite honestly is the most addictive part about Borderlands, are you actually going to like Tales from the Borderlands? Now, let's flip this equation and talk about Game of Thrones Episode 1. Game of Thrones Episode 1 does not use the cel-shaded engine that typically Telltale Games uses. It's still kind of cartoony proportions, but it's no cel shading and it's more of a realistic look to it. However, one weird thing that they did, I think they wanted to kind of stylize it differently from their other Telltale games that are cel-shaded, and they ended up making this kind of fuzziness to the backgrounds and the detail of the characters, which everyone that I've been talking to over the past couple of days has been saying, why did they do that? It makes it look less crisp, less realistic, it looks kind of weird. It's an artistic style that I think they were going for, but the backgrounds end up seeming kind of washed out and blurred out because of it. The frame rate of the game, for whatever reason, is actually a little stuttery. Compared to Tales from the Borderlands, I played Game of Thrones on the same damn PC, and it was a lot less frame rate and stuttering of frame rate versus Tales, and I don't know why that happened, okay? So Game of Thrones is very similar again to Tales from the Borderlands because it is set in the same mainstream universe as the Game of Thrones books and TV series. And if you are a fan of the television series or the books, you're probably going to undoubtedly love this game because in the first episode you get guest appearances by the head of the Forrester family, by Jon Snow, by Tyrion Lannister, by Cersei Lannister. You've got a lot of kind of, like I said, cameo appearances. Are any of these characters integral to the plot and definitely, majorly part of the game? I don't know yet, but they're showing up at least in some periphery scenes. Game of Thrones, for the this Telltale episodic game, follows along the Forrester family. And for those of you who aren't familiar with them, they were actually one of the bannermen of the Stark family, who is kind of the central story of Game of Thrones. So they're this like periphery family, they were always dedicated and loyal to them, and the game opens up, of all places, at the Red Wedding, where the Starks were betrayed by the Freys during a wedding, and basically most of the Starks, if not the bannermen of the Starks, were slaughtered mercilessly. You start out as a squire for Lord Forrester, who ends up taking the Forrester sword and trying to basically run home to bring that sword back when everyone else was slaughtered. In the meantime, unfortunately, you run into some trouble for people who aren't very friendly with you, who end up messing with your family. That gets you into hot water. And when you finally do arrive back home at the homestead, which I forget, it's like Iron Forge or something. I always forget what the name of that place is. Basically now, yes, we decided, what are we going to do? The Starks are dead. It looks like everyone's against them now. What do we do? Because we know that undoubtedly the people who killed the Starks are going to be coming very shortly in order to take over our home. And so you actually play a different variety of characters in this game. You play the Squire that I already mentioned. You play the young sire, who now is like the third or fourth born of the Forrester line, who's only supposed to be like 12 to 15 years old, but he's now actually in charge of the entire family. He is the Lord, and he has to decide, what are we going to do? Because we know that enemy troops are coming, and they're going to want to take over, and they're going to want to take all of our resources, and do we have a more military approach, or do we do a more peaceful approach? And you have to talk to your advisors and decide what you want to do, and decide who's going to be your head advisor, and that kind of stuff. On the flip side, there's a different character who's actually supposed to be one of the eldest daughters of the Forrester family, who's actually serving as a ward of all people, the Lannisters. That's right, she's actually a ward way back at King's Landing, where you've got Joffrey, and you've got Cersei, and you've got Tyrion, and all of them are in charge. She's there basically serving as a handmaiden to Marjorie, who is going to very soon wed Joffrey. And it's interesting because all these characters that I'm mentioning from the Game of Thrones lore, the actual actors from the television show do all the voice acting for them. So if you're a fan of the TV show, the characters look pretty similar, the voice acting is really good. It's like, wow, I feel like I'm watching an episode of the show, okay? Ultimately, the game ends up with a crazy ending that you're like, holy shit, it's very, I'd say, Walking Dead-esque almost, and it's like, wow, it really is Game of Thrones. This is the way that they're going. They're going to try to make it as dark and, you know, crazy as the television show is. I'm not going to spoil anything, but basically, a big and great ending, and it looks like it's going to pick up as the series progresses. So, what's the difference between Tales from the Borderlands and Game of Thrones? Well, Game of Thrones, unlike Tales from the Borderlands, doesn't primarily focus on humor really at all. It's never really kind of doing anything humorous in this episode. It's more somber, it's more serious. It's like, wow, the Starks are dead, and now we really have to decide how we're going to progress on with our family. Because of that, there's not a lot of action. There's a few fights, but there's not a lot of action. It's primarily talking. Now, if you watch the Game of Thrones television show, you're probably used to that, because the primary focus of the show is talking, politics, people being opportunistic and double-crossing each other and having secret agreements under the table and trying to do political espionage to get into a seat of power, etc., etc. And of course, yeah, there'll always be a little supernatural element, and I'm sure that we're going to see all that kind of stuff come into play over the course of the game. But this real first episode, 2 hours, again 2 hours, not 90 minutes like previous Telltale games, but 2 hours of basically talking. So if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, and wow, I got to see Tyrion and Cersei and Marjorie and all these characters that were kind of periphery characters that weren't necessarily fleshed out too much in Game of Thrones television show, I get to find out more about them in this show, or in this game. Great, you're probably going to love it, especially, again, if you like those voice actors or whatever, you're probably going to love this game regardless of the fact that it doesn't have a lot of action. If you're not a fan of Game of Thrones, I couldn't imagine anyone playing this game. And I mean that. Like, unlike The Walking Dead, where if you knew nothing about The Walking Dead, okay, I know nothing about it at all, and I started playing The Walking Dead Episode 1, you don't need to know anything about that series or the lore. Most of the characters are self-explanatory. You understand everything that's going on. Here it's very much, well, if you don't know that King Joffrey has taken over King's Landing, and that Tyrion and Cersei, who they are, and know about the Forresters and their relation and the Freys and the Red Wedding, if you don't know any of that, you're going to be scratching your fucking head like, what the fuck did I just play? I don't understand half of anything, and it was just a lot of talking. And I really feel that's what's going to happen here. So let's review. Tales from the Borderlands is a standalone game that you don't really need to know a lot about Borderlands to play, even though it does have characters from Borderlands here or there integrated into it. A unique cast of characters, a lot of humor, the ability to control the personalities of the people in the game per your dialogue choices, a lot of action, a 2.5-hour action movie comedy thrill ride, but it doesn't really cater to the core audience of Borderlands, because the core people who love Borderlands played it because it's a looter shooter and it's addictive and they love the gameplay, and none of that comes through in Tales from the Borderlands. Game of Thrones, on the other hand, pretty much 100% requires that you're a major fan of Game of Thrones to even understand what's happening in the game, to get the references, to understand who half the people are. There were actually people who were watching me play this game live on stream, and they were like, well, I don't watch Game of Thrones. I don't have a fucking clue who that is or what's going on right now, so I'm just watching, but I think this is boring. And I honestly think that's going to be your answer here is Game of Thrones will seem to be boring to anyone who's not a hardcore fan of the show or the books. So ultimately, when you're choosing, do I want to play Tales from the Borderlands or Game of Thrones? Number one, if you're looking for first-person shooter gameplay, neither of them. Obviously, Tales from the Borderlands is not your game. If you're just addicted to the gameplay of Borderlands, you don't care about the periphery characters, the universe, the Hyperion Corporation, the Raiders of Pandora, and all that, skip it, okay? If you're looking for a narrative-driven experience very similar to previous Telltale Games, episodic games with a lot of comedy, humor, fun, action, and the ability to control stuff, definitely check it out, especially for the fact that it's a very long first episode, okay? If you're looking into Game of Thrones, I can only recommend it to fans of the series. I don't think that anyone else is going to really get any kind of appeal out of it. It's a lot of dialogue, which if you don't like the characters, you're not going to give a shit what the hell they're talking about or any of their political plight. There's almost no action in it. It really is kind of an episode of Game of Thrones that's a slower episode, basically mostly based off of politics, and you're probably going to be like, you know, this is more adult-oriented for someone who likes the series. So that's really going to be your choice. If you really are a hardcore fan of Borderlands, it doesn't matter. You're probably still going to like Tales from the Borderlands. If you are a hardcore fan of Game of Thrones, you'll like it. If you're not, you're probably not going to want to play it. So which game should you play? If it were me and I was completely making a judgment based off of the fun factor, the number of content, the quality of the content, I've got to tell you, Tales from the Borderlands, in my opinion, is a head up above Game of Thrones in this regard. I really think that the game was a lot more fun, that it's a unique cast of new characters that you're going to care about and that they're going to be able to do more with. And that's kind of the other thing about Game of Thrones. It's very limited because it's taking place in this mainstream Game of Thrones universe. Out of nowhere, someone's not going to run up and murder Tyrion Lannister because you know that he's alive in the show. He's not dead, so you know that that can't happen. In Tales from the Borderlands, any of those characters can die or something can happen to them at a moment's notice because they're not part of the mainstream Borderlands story. So there's more of a risk and more of a reward in the story of Tales from the Borderlands than there's going to be here in Game of Thrones. That being said, obviously Game of Thrones caters more to its hardcore fan base for that subject matter. People who like Borderlands may not like Tales from the Borderlands, but people who like Game of Thrones will like the game. So, the final factor that you should make in your decision, the cost and the amount of content. Both of these games are going to have multiple episodes. Supposedly Tales from the Borderlands is going to have 5, similarly to The Walking Dead. Apparently Game of Thrones is going to have 6. Now, I could be mistaken, but I'm just going off of what I saw. Information on Steam said that there were going to be 6 episodes. I think because of that, the prices were adjusted appropriately. Where Tales from the Borderlands is currently selling for between $22 to $25. I got it during a one-day sale, and I don't know if the sale's still going on or not. While Game of Thrones is a full $30. So it's a little bit more expensive for Game of Thrones, but if you're going to get an extra hour and a half to 2 hours of content by the end of the game, it might make sense that they're charging a little bit more. So ultimately, it really is based off of you and your preferences. What are you looking for? Are you looking for overall the better game, or are you a fan of Game of Thrones and you want to get that tie-in? That's really going to be your decision. For me personally, I gotta say, Tales from the Borderlands gets 2 thumbs up. Game of Thrones for me probably gets like 1.5 thumbs up. It's good, it's not great. It didn't like, wow, blow me away like Tales from the Borderlands did. I definitely think that's the better episodic game to jump into. If you had to decide between the two, check that one out first. Let's see where Game of Thrones goes and if it picks up and gets any better or makes any sense to anyone who doesn't necessarily know all of the information about the game universe. I'm sorry, the book and TV show universe. That's it, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed this comparison first impressions video. I hope that it helps you make your decision. Thanks a lot. Peace out, and I'll see you later.